Okay, so I work at Cloudflare. I think some of you might know it, especially when we have a captcha to show you. Maybe others don't. Maybe so. Let me start talking a bit about it. We are we're not like Google. We're smaller. We have servers all around the world. We started as a CDN doing DDoS protection, but we've doing other things as well. So we have some free services like RDNS, but we also have a workers platform. If you know Amazon Lambda, it's like similar to that. And we have a Zero Trust suite that's like a VPN for enterprises and such. All in all, we depending on how you count it, we're involved with about 1 in every 5 websites. And of the Fortune 500, about half of them are our paying customers. And to give a sense of scale, we do about 102 million HTTP requests per second. And for TLS connections, so that's the thing where the post-quantum cryptography is coming in, that's about 15 million per second. Because we are a big party, we all feel we have responsibility to push forward the technology, right? Because we are big, we can actually make things happen, and we feel responsible to do so. So one of the big things before I joined in 2014 is that we offered SSL, back then called SSL, now it's called TLS, certificates for free. And when I was younger, I remember that to get secure website, you would need to have a separate IP address. You didn't have SNI yet, and you had to go to certificate authority and pay, I think it was maybe 15 euros per year or something, just to get a certificate to get a secure website. So that's a real change from just 10 years ago. Other things we've worked on is encrypting DNS. We also one of the hops in Apple Private Relay. Encrypted client hello is another. And of course, the topic of this talk is deploying post-quantum cryptography. Now, enough about Cloudflare. There's a lot I could cover, so I thought, what would be interesting? So I think maybe I'd start with how the threat model changes if Q-Day comes closer. And after that, I want to give a status of where we are with deployment of PQC and the plans, including Merkle Tree certificates. I'm really happy with what Frederick covered because he did a lot of groundwork for me. And the last topic, I think, which is very interesting and not enough talked about, is how to prevent downgrades. Please, if you have questions, interrupt me. I think it always works a lot better, such a lecture, if there's a lot of questions. Okay. So, as Frederick already showed, there's been some recent concerns about approaching timelines. And we work a lot with Google in PQC, and around January we noticed that the people we work with, they were getting a bit antsy. And in March we figured out what it was. And I think from what Frederick said, I want to add a reason why people can get caught off guard here is because to eventually do the quantum attack, there's actually three layers. You have the quantum hardware, which can see improvement. You have the quantum error correction, which can see improvement. And you have the algorithm running, which see improvement. And these improvements, they multiply with each other. So even if one of them only improves 2 times, another one 2. And what we saw is that the algorithm got 20 times better, the hardware gets better, and the error correcting code for some hardware got better. So together, it made a real difference if you look at all of them together. And on the hardware side, where I think 10 years ago, there's different approaches, neutral atoms, ion trap, superconducting circuits, photonics, and each of them have their own particular problems. And 10 years ago, these problems seem so insurmountable that you would think, oh, maybe one of them might work out. Now, some of them didn't seem so successful. Some are more successful than others. Every single one of them still has has a challenge to solve. But the list is quite short now, scarily short now, I would say. So not to worry about it would mean that every single one of these approaches needs to hit a wall. And in particular, the neutral atom one is the one which is not the only one, but that's the one that's particularly worrisome, where there's not that much work left to be done. It's likely that the very first proper neutral atom quantum computer will be a cryptographically relevant one, which is why not just Google, but we decided to pull forward our timeline to migrate to be done by 2029. Do you think there is a quantum computer in 2030? Probably not. But the thing is that it's not about when you expect there to be a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, because if you migrate before you expect it, then you're late 50% of the time. So you rather leave in some margin. And we think, honestly, 2029 is the date that's realistic. 2028 might have an argument, but there's no way that it gets done in time. To put a number to it, it's hard. We think it's about a 10% chance that 2030 there will be a cryptographically relevant quantum computer. So it depends on your risk appetite. Okay. So, if you do cryptography, as Frederik said, symmetric cryptography is fine. You don't need to change that. So what cryptography do you need to change? There's a lot of cryptography out there, but the workhorses of cryptography, apart from the symmetric cryptography that's already fine, is the key agreement and the signatures. So with the key agreement, you, as showed the protocol, you do this dance and you get a shared secret which someone can't snoop on. So you establish a shared secret without anyone else being able to establish it. Then you use that shared secret to communicate. If that key agreement algorithm is broken, then you can record when that key agreement happens, you can break it, and then you can decrypt it retroactively. So the key agreement is urgent if Q-Day is far away, because all encrypted data that you have can retroactively be decrypted if it's vulnerable. So that's the famous harvest now, decrypt later. So that's not the key agreement is great. You establish a shared secret, but you don't know with whom. Because if I do this exchange, I could have done it with someone in the middle, someone else. And then we indeed have a secure key, but not with the person you wanted to with. So to solve that bit, there's the second ingredient, which is signatures. For instance, on the web, after you do the key agreement, the server sends you a certificate, which is a signature signed by a trusted third party, a certificate authority, which says you can trust this website for this domain. And with that, you have confidence that you're actually talking to the right website. Okay. Signatures, depending on how they're used, are not as urgent because these keys are secure until there's a quantum computer. Once there is you need just to get rid of quantum vulnerable signatures before the quantum computer arrives. So if the Q-Day is far away, it feels less urgent. The problem is that it's harder to do, as we will see. But this changes if it's coming closer, because although a lot of data is very, very sensitive, typically, if you see the encrypted data and you don't know that there's something sensitive in there, then it's not the best use of an attack, typically. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. Whereas with signatures, typically they're very high-value keys. For instance, you can find SSH public keys everywhere to do remote login. If I forget to remove one vulnerable remote login key, an attacker can have access to a system. Also, you know typically what the key does. You have to break it once and you get in a lot of places. For instance, web PKI, certificate authority, root keys, they're trusted in so many different places. It's just break one key, you get a lot of access. Another one, probably that's very valuable, is the software signing keys in iPhones or on cars or on Internet of Things or Microsoft update keys. That becomes really scary. Also, there's with signatures, forget one, and there's a point of entry. And it's not just these high-value keys, but also even if you have a mundane connection where you don't think there's a lot of security, because you assumed that it was a secure connection, you don't really do security checks. So it also increases the attack surface incredibly. So that's one thing. If Q-Day comes closer, it's the signatures that are much more worrisome than the key agreement. Of course, we also want to protect data, but access is also really important. Okay. Again, it also depends on what kind of quantum attacker we have, because it depends on which approach for quantum computing will be the first quantographically relevant quantum computer, because there's quite a difference between them. With some approaches, the quantum computer will be very slow and will be hard to scale. So then we would expect it to cost perhaps $100,000 to break a single key. You're not going to break every key agreement if it costs $100,000. But at some point, but depending on which will win, it might be a lot cheaper. It can be the case that architecture used for quantum computers scales cheaply, and then it's much easier. It's much more worthwhile to break the key agreements. So the difference here as well is if you want to break a key used for access, a signature, to actually use that, you need to log in, which might not always leave. It could lead trace route. Not that people always look, but so if you break the signatures, that's scary, but it's also there's a chance to detect it. Whereas if quantum computers are plentiful and fast, and you can break the key agreements, that's completely passive. It will be hard to detect unless you act upon data and you notice this in that way. So it's a bit similar to the Enigma. So another thing so these mentions from my colleague Sophia Google. Another thing she mentioned is that there's kind of two ways that this can unfold. It might be that most of it happens in public. So we see statements of laboratories, how far they are with development. The problem there is that it's really hard to distinguish signal from noise. I mean, there's so much hype around there, so much investment, which also requires people to show off that the invested money goes somewhere. And then still that timeline might lag behind some other private adversaries. What can also happen is that the private progress is much further ahead of the public progress. And that's really hard to detect. Maybe some weird compromises. And once we detect it, it will probably have been used for quite a while. Okay. So far on what changes in the threat model. Before we check on a PQC deployment, I want to make some general remarks on deploying things on the internet. So the internet is very diverse. There's a lot of different stakeholders, and there's no boss of the internet. And which have all very different constraints, right? Some people, they have very tiny devices which can't run anything, don't have very little memory. And there's also very high performance. There's people on fiber connections for which data doesn't matter, and there's people in rural areas with your spotty satellite internet. And we need to update. We need something that works for all of it. Another problem is that despite the internet being built to be upgradable, so the protocols are all upgradable, are all what they call crypto-agile. If this flexibility is not used in practice, it turns out that there are bugs because of broken implementations. We'll get to an example of that in a bit. I have to say that it might give the wrong impression that it's like super hard. The internet, I think, is especially hard because it's so diverse. And in a lot of cases, like for instance, we also upgraded our internal network and we didn't see any of these issues there. So if you have just an internal network or a smaller system, things can be much easier and will be much more straightforward. So an example before Postquantum is the migration to TLS 1.3. So TLS 1.3 is basically so TLS started as SSL, which contains a lot of errors. the very first version of SSL, by the way, was just key agreements. And I hear an anecdote that this was presented at I think at Stanford, and then the SSL2 was presented, and then someone in the audience said, and there was just the key agreement. Someone in the audience said, but what if there's a man in the middle? And then I was, oh yeah, maybe we should do something about that. So the signatures was, so in that way, SSL stumbled from one era to another and also added more and more and more variants until TLS 1.2. It's probably secure, but it's kind of a bit messy. So TLS 1.3, we started from scratch, started clean slate. We got academics involved instead of just going from one iteration to the other. And we tried to deploy it. And it turned out to be completely undeployable. Because even though TLS allowed you to negotiate which version you use by version field, there were a lot of pieces of software out there that just look at the version field and say, if that version field is not TLS 1.2, oh, we're not going to do it, and it will break. So there's a linked blog post here where my old boss, Nick, discusses why TLS 1.3 is not deployed yet. The solution to it was to make TLS 1.3 look like TLS 1.2 on the wire. So if you look at a packet dump of a TLS 1.3 connection, it looks like it's actually TLS 1.2, and then in some room where there was space where people didn't look, is actually the 1.3 stuff. So the nice protocol is hidden in the ugly protocol. So luckily we got this all done, and and now TLS 1.3 is used in all but 4% of all traffic. But this took about 9 years. While 9 is a bit exaggerating, because we were already at 90% at about 6 years. But it takes a long time. So the point is, to keep cryptography agile, you need to exercise the agility. So just having agility is not enough, you need to exercise it. Now, so what about Postquantum? There's the key agreement and there's the signatures. So the key agreement, when we started, that's the urgent thing. So we started with that. Back in 2019, we deployed it on our side because we have a lot of the server side, and Chrome deployed it on the client side. And we tested it. What we tested is something that is not the same as, we tested 3 things. We tested something that's similar to MLChem. It's not MLChem, but Lattice is very similar to it. We tested a Arsonogy-based one, Cyc, which famously got broken pretty badly. And we tested, of course, not doing cryptography. And here, there's the graphs show the comparison in performance. It looks like it's two diagrams, but it's actually 3. So the green one is Cyc, it's the Arsonogy one, which is small but slow, and that has a noticeable impact. The orange line, which is barely distinguishable from the blue line, that is lattices in a hybrid mode. So it's both lattices and elliptic curves at the same time, and that's barely distinguishable from the elliptic curves on their own, which shows you how efficient it is. In the long tail, actually, there were some differences in performance. In fact, Google originally deployed first on desktop, because on mobile, they have automatic testing for when they can deploy a change, and if some metrics are too far in the red, degrade too far, they're not allowed to roll it out without further approval. And in the case of Android, and especially on spotty networks, they had some significant but not bad enough degradation because of the size, that they needed extra approval to roll it out. And that's just with adding only 1 kilobyte. Another thing that was a problem is that there were a lot of, because it's 1 kilobyte now, the original message that's sent in setting up a connection doesn't fit in one network packet anymore. Even though TLS is defined that you're allowed to use multiple packets, if all the time, the only thing you see is a network is a first message, which is one packet. And programmers get lazy; they only allocate one packet, or they make load balancers that just look at the first packet. And most of the vast majority of software was implemented correctly, but about maybe 2% wasn't. And 2% is enough to halt deployment. You can't deploy something and break 2% of all users. You can't even break 0.1% of all users at this scale. So the strategy was, we already deployed it completely across Cloudflare. Chrome deployed it and slowly ramps it up from a tenth of a percent to a percent until they find an error, and then they work with the vendor to fix it. Then they go back, ramp up a little bit more until there's more complaints, and this took a few years. So from 2019, we tried to scale up. It was quite difficult, and in 2022, the MLCAM came out as a standard, and then we decided we switched to that, and then we continued with the slow rollout. Most of the progress was made in 2025, where you can see at the start of it, it was only a few percent, and across 2025, I think this must have been Chrome Desktop, where they finally were able to go from 10% to 100%, and the second one is Android. The funny thing there is that when Chrome Desktop was at 10% for quite a long time, there weren't any errors reported. And how this worked is that it's 10% randomly chosen per Chrome client, per Chrome browser. And when they went to 100%, you would think, okay, if 10% of your organization's Chrome browser is not working, you will notice it, right? People will report it. But the funniest thing is that that a lot of reports came in when they went from 10% to 100%. So literally, when only everyone's Chrome breaks, then errors get bubbled up. So that's a funny thing about how slow deployments don't really catch errors. Sometimes you really have to break everyone to learn if something is broken. From 2025, it's been going up. It's not just Chrome. Firefox added support by default. Safari, Edge, OpenSSL. The list is too long to give. Basically, almost everything now, every modern library now supports a Postquantum key agreement by default. And if we look at traffic with Cloudflare, so that's measuring support of clients, it's now about 70%, and this is what we suspect not to be automated requests, which is good. By the way, this last ramp up that's macOS and iOS 26, which enabled it by default in November. 70%, good. If you look at bots, which is more indicative of not that well-maintained software, it's less. I don't think a lot of automated scrapers are enabling Postquantum by default. Probably most of them don't care, but they get it by default because of software updates. And so that's clients. What about servers? So Jan Sharman from Akamai, he had a look, and he found that 41% of the top 1 million domains supported. Which is last February, which is quite a bit higher already than 28% in March. Most of that, though, is Cloudflare and Google, because they're behind CDNs. So how it works is, instead of going to the website, to the server of a customer itself, people put Cloudflare or something else in between, and then it will the first leg will be Postquantum. So that's that. So one is 70%. Leg 2 in the middle, we deployed on most of the connections already. And leg 3, that's the one I showed the graph. This is where we measure how much of our customer servers support it. And that's not that high. It's only about 10% now, which is quite a bit better than the less than 1% it was just a year ago. But this is I think this is more indicative of how far industry in general is on internal networks, which is not very far. Another thing to note, by the way, is that X2519 MLChem 768, which is the Postquantum key agreement that's being deployed widely now, is not even, strictly speaking, an RFC yet. I expect it to be an RFC in a couple of weeks. But what you see here is that these standards are deployed before they're actually completely a standard yet. And there's some reading the tea leaves here, because in this case, this will not change anymore. Even though it's not technically a standard, for all practical purposes, this is a standard and ready to go. Okay, so all in all, this is great progress, but I think we can only celebrate once we hit 95%, because we still leave 30% unprotected on the edge, and on internal networks, it's much less. And this will take many years. Easy one, and this took 7 years. Now, okay, now to signatures. Previously I would say it's less urgent but much more challenging. Well, it's still much more challenging, but it's more urgent now. Why is it challenging? It's because you have many more parties. If you want to have post-quantum key agreement against harvest now, decrypt later, you just have to update the server and the client and update on both sides. It's a software update, and you're done. With signatures, you have of course, you have still the library developers and the server and the client, but you also have the certificate authorities, you have the hardware, the HSMs, you have certificate transparency logs, and you have every script that the system administrator might have cobbled together that uses RSA. Another problem is that, and Frederik already showed the signatures, there's no all-around great signature scheme. So none of them are all in the green like ECDSA. We got so lucky with elliptic curves. They are the best in every possible metric, and then just in one scheme. The other schemes that are available now are MLDSA, SLHDSA, and LMS. So LMS is stateful hash-based signature, which you have to keep the state. That's not workable in most cases. You have SLHDSA. Well, that's not really deployable in most use cases. And another problem with SLHDSA, so one reason people sometimes like it, is because the security is conservative. If you're thinking, though, about connection security, you can break the signature or the key agreement. If you break the key agreement, you can also do a man in the middle. So you need both of them. So the security of TLS is the security of the weakest of the two. So even if you replace the certificates with SLHDSA, there's still MLChem in the key agreement. So really only MLDSA makes sense for TLS. Now we have HQC as a replacement for MLChem, but the performance is really terrible. I think that if we were left with HQC, then probably we would just redesign the way TLS works by not doing a key agreement every time and trying to figure it out in a different way. The performance is really too bad for HQC. Okay, so MLDSA is basically the only option we have now, and that's also the option we will have to live with. So there's a lot of really exciting signature algorithms on the horizon. So here's a summary of it. I mean, none of them are all in the green, but at least with some of them, there's a line with, for instance, Mayo is nice. But it's still not as great as elliptic curve. There's better, but still not great as elliptic curves. And that is, of course, ignoring security. The one that is closest here is FNDSA, Falcon. But as a reality check, the standard is not out yet. I expect the draft is not even out yet. I expect the draft will take at least a year, probably 2 years, to be fully reviewed. Then it will take another year for the final standard to come out. And then it will take at least another year for the standards, how to integrate it into protocols to be written. And another year for software libraries to gain support for it. I think it's very unlikely that FNDSA is generally available any anywhere before 2031. I don't think the standard will be there before 2029, and I don't think software will be widely available before 2031, which is too late for us. And I think that for most people, this is with any deadline, that's cutting it very close. And the others are even later. I think SkiSign or Mayo, I don't expect that to be anywhere before 2034. So it is MLDSA. And as Eric Rescorla, the designer of TLS, quipped, you go to war with the algorithms you have, not the ones you wish you had. MLDSA will have to do. Now, so there's a lot of parties, there's no all-round great signature scheme, and the third problem is there's a lot of signatures on the web. So if you make a TLS connection, there's 5 signatures and 2 public keys. So you have there's the signature on the transcript hash, which proves that you're indeed involved in a protocol. There's the public key for that. That's the public key of the server. That public key is signed by a certificate authority. As we have it today, it's not directly by a certificate authority, but by an intermediate certificate, because certificate authorities, they like to have an offline key. They put that in they put that in a safe, they put it in a Faraday cage because that feels secure. But then they still have but they have to sign online, and that they do that with an intermediate certificate. Which, by the way, if you can break the intermediate certificate, you basically have a CA anyway, so the whole difference is not that useful. But this is the reality we have today, where you have, in a connection, you have a root, the signature of the root on the intermediate, the public key of the intermediate, the signature of the intermediate on the server certificate, the public key of the server certificate, and then the signature on a transcript hash. And that is not all. There's 2 more signatures. And those signatures are for certificate transparency. So who here doesn't know what certificate transparency is? Okay. So famously, I'm from the Netherlands, and I'm trying to make a positive contribution to the security on the internet. Another famous Dutch contribution to internet security is DigiNotar, which was, I think, maybe more than a decade ago. It was a Dutch certificate authority, which got hacked by the Iranians. And the Iranians, allegedly, and they issued a certificate for gmail.com, I think. Now, luckily, Chrome, they tried to read the email of some dissidents. Dissidents used Chrome, and luckily Chrome hardcodes the certificate it expects from gmail.com, so they detected this. So in response to this, Chrome was obviously upset. Pinning certificates is not a scalable approach. You can't pin every certificate there is. So instead, what the ecosystem, what was set up then is what is called certificate transparency. This means that a browser will not trust any certificate. Instead, you have to submit, a CA has to submit a certificate it wants to publish. It has to submit that to independent parties, which are called certificate transparency logs. And these logs will publicly log the certificate they see. So a CA submits it, the log logs it, and publishes it for everyone to see. In return of logging it, this certificate transparency log gives us a receipt, which is called a signed certificate timestamp, an SCT, which the CA can include in a certificate, in a final certificate, to prove that the certificate has been publicly logged. But this is, again, yet another signature. So we have 2 extra signatures to prove that the certificate has been publicly logged. So all in all, that's 5 signatures, 2 public keys. Maybe another thing with, maybe you've ever went to the website crt.sh. It's a website that scrapes the certificate transparency logs, and then you can search in the list of all certificates. So basically the list of all certificates published, and you can see online. So certificate transparency doesn't prevent certificates being misissued, but at least you can follow the certificates issued for your website, and you can cross-reference whether there's anything fishy that went down. And this has caused a lot of misissuances. Most of them are from negligence, actually. it's mostly catching sloppy behavior of CAs. So if we replace this with MLDSA as is, we are looking at adding 15 kilobytes. You would think if you watch a YouTube video, who cares about 14 kilobytes extra? In that case, it doesn't matter. But that's not typical. We had a look. We tested what's the effect of the performance, and of course, there's a performance impact just by the size. The bump there, by the way, is if you hit the size limit of initial congestion window, if you know how TCP works. If you have that limit, then you need another round trip, which adds to it. Ours is higher, so actually it should be, that bump should actually be to the left. It should be around 10 in typical cases. Chrome, again, from the experience with deploying MLChem, they found 1 kilobyte already hard. They say 7 kilobytes is for us the limit, unless a quantum computer is tangibly imminent, which might be triggered at some point. And also, another thing that we see is that of all the connections we have, half of the connections with Cloudflare that use Quick transfer less than 8 kilobytes, of which already about half is already certificates. So today already, on half of the connections, certificates account for a quarter of everything that's transferred. So the problem here is that with just performance is that it's if you have to do, you deploy, but you, unless everyone believes it's imminent, people will not accept a performance degradation before they're convinced. So to be able to deploy it now, which means it's better so that we're not too late, we better make it more efficient. And of course, there was protocol ossification. In that same experiment where we looked at the performance of having larger signatures, we saw that around 10 and 30 kilobytes, if you make your certificate larger than 10 or larger than 30 kilobytes, there was a surprising lack of responses. So there seem to be servers and mailboxes that don't like it if your certificates become larger than that. All right. So how are we solving this? So the way we solve this is with Merkle trees. So I'm really glad that Frederick already explained what Merkle trees are. The idea is that in certificate transparency already, the logs which publish all the certificates they see, they actually publish them in a Merkle tree, so that it's easy to show that nothing was changed or removed. So it's not just a Merkle tree, it's a Merkle tree that continuously grows. Now, what we do is we now use that trick for CAs itself. So a CA originally a CA would log what they issue, and now we're flipping the script. A CA issues by logging. What does that mean? A certificate authority, what it does is, instead of signing each certificate separately, a certificate authority publishes an ever-growing Merkle tree. And once in a while, it signs the tree head of that Merkle tree. So every second, maybe, it signs a new tree head of a Merkle tree, and it publishes all the certificates it issues. Every hour or so, the CA says, this tree head is special. We call it a landmark. So every hour there's a special tree head, which we call a landmark. Now, if you have a certificate, you can now the browsers they fetch, not the browser itself, but the browser vendors or other parties. They fetch from each CA. They fetch what they are publishing. This already happens. All browsers are already, browser vendors and Mozilla and Google are already fetching, and a lot of other people are fetching from the certificate authorities all the certificates they issue to check if something is going wrong. Here they will continue to do that. And they will fetch the tree, the landmarks. Now, if everything looks all right, they send these landmarks to the browser. And now a browser which goes to a server, it can say to the server, I have these landmarks. And if on the server you have a certificate which falls below a landmark, then instead of having to include all the signatures, you can just include the Merkle tree authentication proof. So if you already know that a landmark was published by a CA as a browser, and you get a certificate with the inclusion proof that it belongs in this landmark, then you know it was properly published, and you know it was, yeah, the CA did it, and you know it was publicly logged. And it's small. If you put all certificates now in such a Merkle tree, and you have about 300 landmarks, then you're looking at a proof which is about 700 bytes. There's a few downsides. You only get these small certificates if you wait a bit. You have to wait for the landmark to be created. Before that, you can just include the signatures again. So then you get what we call a standalone Merkle tree certificate. That's the one larger with more signatures. It's not as small, but it still works. Another is that if you switch from provider, you need a certificate immediately, and so in those cases you need a standalone certificate. So we had an intern do an estimate, and we think you would need it about 0.1% of time. Yeah?
So in order for that to work, you need to be online. You need to fetch a new signature, a new tree, basically.
Yeah, so the question, I'll repeat your question. Yeah. The question is, you need to be online for this to work.
How does it work in a corporate environment from server to server?
Yeah, server to server. Yeah, so you don't need to be online all the time. You need to be online sometimes, right? If you've depends on how long the landmarks are valid. We're thinking about maybe 4-5 days. So you need to be online once every 4 or 5 days to get it, for it to work. Yes, in a corporate environment. In most cases, in a corporate environment, you don't even need Merkle tree certificates. But you would only need Merkle tree certificates if you care about the size, and you care about the transparency. And in a lot of corporate networks, that's not a big issue. Another way if you still need it in a corporate network, well, you could put a proxy in between. You could, I imagine, it's an open question how to actually pull these on systems. So for instance, I imagine that if you have an integrated system like Android or iOS, it will be part of iOS to fetch this, just like you have a system certificate verifier now. It will just pull the landmarks probably from Apple or a third party. You could imagine that this is a configurable thing, just like enterprise might have their own DNS endpoint that they can configure. They probably can have something configured like this as well. But this is an open gap where it's not yet fleshed out how people are going to do it. Yeah. Okay. So late last year, we started testing this again with Chrome. We supported it on 10,000 sites. Chrome supports it now, a preliminary version. We have it now, we use Merkle tree certificates, but we don't use it with a Postquantum leaf yet, because we are not a certificate authority, so we cannot issue MTCs ourselves. So instead, we repurpose existing certificates. The result so far is that it's actually faster, because there's less things to stand, even in the classical case. So it's already 9% faster, and the gap will, of course, be much larger when used with PQ. Another thing that is interesting is to see is how fast can clients get these landmarks. If you, there was a fun little accident where we had to change something about the landmarks. So all Chrome browsers had to refetch them, and that was a good opportunity to measure how fast these landmarks could be pushed down to browsers. And we saw that most of Chrome got the update in just 2 hours. So took just 2 hours to get the new landmarks out. And the steady state was about 0.5%, 1.5%. And I have to say from Chrome is that they didn't really, there were some quirks in the way that they do it now, and that number, the proper number is probably a bit lower. So it's probably more like, maybe 0.2, what we would expect to see actually. So what's the plan going forward? We are standardizing this at the IETF, at the newly formed plans working group. Also, there's discussion how the main purpose is doing it through web PKI, but there's also discussion how to use it in private PKIs. Chrome sees this as the only path forward for post-quantum certificates, and they have already started working with CAs to get these out. And we expect that early 2027, Chrome will the first Merkle tree CA roots will be included in Chrome. It's quite a bit different in how it works, but I want to mention that the biggest change is for the certificate authorities. They have to make the biggest changes. If for software, it's just like an X59. It still uses X59. It's mostly like an X59 certificate. To make heads and tails of Merkle tree certificates is not that big of a software update to be able to use a standalone MTC. But that one, of course, is not the one with the size savings. If you want the size savings, which is the goal, you need to get the landmarks in some way, and that, of course, requires a bit of work. But I think there's already an effort on the way to have more updatable root stores anyway. So in Linux, you have Ubuntu has the effort which is called UPKI to automatically fetch revocation lists, and that is exactly the right shape to do Merkle tree certificates as well. So that's to see how that works. Again, private PKIs, if they care about it, they can use it. But if you have fast internal networks, you probably don't really need it, and you can deploy MLDSA today without Merkle tree certificates. Okay, let's see, 10 minutes. Let's see what I think I'll skip over this bit, and I'll just go to something I think is interesting, which is downgrades. So if Q-Day is far away, it's about getting some PQ out. But deploying post-quantum is not enough. We add support for post-quantum, which is great. But it's not secure unless you turn off vulnerable cryptography. If you have a server which supports both a classical certificate and a post-quantum certificate, and you have a client that supports a post-quantum certificate and a classical certificate, that's all great. But if you have an attacker in the middle, they can force you to downgrade to classical. I'll walk through this in a bit. The easiest solution to prevent such a downgrade is to just turn off classical cryptography. But this is not realistic. We can't even get rid of all the TLS 1.2 now. We can't even get rid of all the unencrypted traffic. And with these timelines, it is just not feasible in any serious system to turn off classical cryptography everywhere. So what to do? Well, let's think through this. So it's important to distinguish between two cases, because you have servers that might be legacy, not upgraded yet, and servers that are upgraded to use PQ. And you have the case that clients are legacy, not upgraded to PQ yet, and clients that are upgraded. If you have a legacy client, well, with a legacy server, it will just have a classical certificate that's vulnerable. Okay, nothing to do. And a legacy client will want to be able to talk to an upgraded server. An upgraded server will want to continue to service legacy clients. Even after Q-Day, I mean, it is not secure, but in most cases, availability is more important than security. And the client is legacy anyway, there's not much you can do. So an upgraded server will have, of course, a post-quantum certificate, but it will also need to have a classical certificate for a legacy client. Now, if you have a client that's upgraded to support post-quantum cryptography, it will still want to be able to visit websites that are not upgraded yet. So a post-quantum client will need to continue to accept a classical certificate from a legacy server, which is vulnerable, but I mean, if the server is not upgraded to support PQ, there's not much you can do about that. The upgraded client, if it talks to the upgraded server will give it a post-quantum certificate, which is great. But here there's the downgrade problem. Because what can happen is that a post-quantum client wants to talk to an upgraded server. There's an attacker in the middle, and that attacker says, oh, no, I'm not an upgraded server. I'm actually a legacy server. So here is a classical certificate, which they can forge after Q-Day. And the PQ client is nothing to know the wiser. So how to solve this? One way, there are three ways. There's turning it off completely, but that's not realistic in most cases. And then there's two other ways. One of them is what Eric Erskola calls PQ lock, or I would call PQ HTSC. And both of these methods actually will be used in practice. So PQ HTSC, maybe if you know HSTS already today, that's where a server says, I support encryption, don't trust it next time you visit me, you must expect encryption. And this would be the same. The server says, I support PQ certificates, next time don't allow a connection with me unless you see a post-quantum certificate. This is great because we already with HSTS, we kind of have experience with this kind of mechanism, but it has downside. The downside is that it doesn't work for the first connection. You have a preload list, but that one doesn't scale to all websites. And it can cause surprise breakages where people don't realize what they deploy, right? They change provider, or they change the configuration, or you have a load balancer where one of them is PQ and the other one is not on the backend. And then people don't realize, and it suddenly breaks. So that's a problem with PQ HSTS. But it will be used, I think, a lot to help. So that's one. But I think the more scalable way is to lean into transparency. And the key idea here is that there are two types of classical certificates, which we saw. Namely, in the case here, the classical certificate that you have at the upgraded server and the classical certificate you have at the legacy server, they don't have to be the same thing, and it's really important that they're not the same thing. Because the classical certificate at the PQ server, that's a classical certificate meant for a legacy client. And an upgraded client should never accept a certificate meant for a legacy client. And then the certificate for a legacy server, that's a server that's not able to sign a post-quantum handshake. That's a different kind of classical certificate. The nice thing about that certificate is that the signature of the certificate authority can actually be post-quantum. If you have in the one on the right, the one for the legacy client will not know anything about PQ. You cannot put a PQ signature in there. It doesn't help anything. But at least for the classical certificate for a legacy server, you can put a post-quantum signature by the certificate authority in there, which makes it that at least it has to be a certificate authority that issued it. And you can put in post-quantum equivalents of SCTs. So what does this mean in practice? What this means in practice is that if you go to a checker like SSL Labs or another checker to check a website, you can put in your website, and that checker can check certificate transparency and see which certificates are issued for your website. Of course, PQ certificate, that's fine. Also, if there's a classical certificate for a legacy client issued, so if there's a classical certificate for legacy client, that's also fine. An upgraded client will not accept it. But if you see a classical certificate for a legacy server in certificate transparency for your server, then you can add a warning. You can add, this server is vulnerable to quantum attack. So in this way, so in this way, to actually do the downgrade, you first have to convince a CA to issue such a downgrade certificate, which is a regular misissuance, and you can detect it using certificate transparency as usual, and you have something that actually has a good UX where you can just put in the website in some online checker, and it will actually tell you if it's fully post-quantum. So I think this is the way to go, and this of course requires post-quantum certificate transparency. Okay. Signatures, very little time. We're moving faster than ever, but it will be very tight. And I mean, this is not even all. This is the internet is not just TLS. There's so much more cryptography out there, and especially if you're interested if you do cryptography and you're interested in solving these, we are collecting a list of fancy cryptography on the GitHub, crowdsource it, where we have a list of all kind of cryptography beyond just signatures and key agreements, such as, for instance, blind signatures, anonymous credentials, PEGs. And a lot of these don't even have a workable post-quantum alternative. So that's a great list of research topics. So MLChem, LMDZ, they will have to do. Migrations take a long time, and we're not done until we've dealt with downgrades. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.